I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I truly hope you're sound, safe, and healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, I'm truly pleased and honored to host General David Petraeus, for I guess what I would describe as a whirlwind tour of global problems. I can think of no better guide, and he needs no introduction. I only say he's a partner and chairman of KKR, Global Institute, which he established in May 2013. Prior to founding KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, and serving as director of Central Intelligence Agency from 2011 to 2012. So, General Petraeus, let me welcome you back, actually, at Carnegie Connects. We had a good conversation a year ago on Iraq and Afghanistan, and certainly a lot has changed since then. I want to start by asking you to react to a sort of frame. Then we can drill down, as we certainly will, on Ukraine, on Russia, on China, on North Korea, on Iran, and perhaps maybe on the challenges at home facing the Republic. Let me start just with a minute or so. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the world out there for the Biden administration and many of his successors, his predecessors and successors, is turning out to be a pretty cruel and forgiving place. It's largely a world, if transformation were possible, that would be great, but it's largely a world, as I see it, to be managed in an effort to advance interests of U.S. and its allies. Constitution doesn't talk about perfecting a more perfect world, it talks about perfecting a more perfect union. And while the United States has tremendous capacity to lead, witness the last 4 months in Ukraine, it does so with serious constraints. Whether, as the president has argued, President Biden, the 21st century will belong to America, or at least there'll be a struggle between the forces of autocracy and democracy in which the latter must prevail or not, it is a complicated multipolar world where powers large and small challenge American interests and influence, and at the same time, new transnational problems, pandemic, climate, nuclear proliferation, preservation of biodiversity, demand international responses. As I look out there, it's hard to identify a single challenge that appears to have a definitive or a comprehensive solution, let alone one that we can deliver even with the help of our allies. And finally, as you pointed out before, we need what you call a comprehensive and coherent U.S. policy. Dare I would even add, at the risk of, a great risk, a bipartisan strategy. At a time when we are as badly divided and polarized a country, perhaps at any point in the last 70 years. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about foreign policy philosophy, but I'd like to see whether or not I think that frame is reasonable. Too negative?
No, I think it's about right. And first, could I just correct something in your introduction of me? You said that I founded KKR. I wish I'd founded KKR, but really Henry Kravis, George Roberts, taken in view of that misrepresentation. I founded the KKR Global Institute within this extraordinary global investment firm that is KKR, and I'm privileged to be a partner in the firm as well. You have captured correctly that we face the most complex array and varied array of challenges that any of us have experienced in our lifetimes, and arguably since the end of World War II. It is extraordinarily demanding, and the U.S. uniquely has to figure out how to address all these different challenges. Yes, we have allies and partners that help us address some of them. And yes, the policy should always be comprehensive, integrated, coherent, and also the way whole of governments with an S on the end, again, to recognize the importance of allies and partners in addressing these different challenges. I think the metaphorical image that is best for this is to describe the United States uniquely in the world as the guy in the circus who has to get a plate spinning and then more plates spinning. Some of the plates are much bigger than others. We'll talk about the US and Western relationship with China. That plate is probably bigger than all of the, but there are many, many other plates that have to be kept spinning. Sometimes they grow in size because of the seriousness, as is the case with Russia and Ukraine right now. Others are just sort of somewhat tractable. You just try to manage them. I would have argued that we should have tried to manage Afghanistan, candidly, for a good bit longer, as long as the effort is sustainable in terms of the expenditure of blood and treasure. That it can be sustained for a period of time. So think, though, about what this represents. That means that the U.S. has to lead in just about all of these. We have allies and partners, some, a lot of them in some of the cases that help keep these two more in the form of Finland and Sweden, both very capable, by the way. We had their forces in the International Security Assistance Force when I was privileged to command in Afghanistan. But again, you have North Korea, again, pretty intractable, Iran, that we'll talk about, probably that is quickly becoming what could be the real wolf closest to the sled in terms of something that has to be addressed that really has not yet been addressed adequately and could be literally quite explosive. Obviously, again, we talked about Russia and the world. And again, we've learned over the last 20 years that ungoverned or inadequately governed spaces in the Muslim world will often be exploited by Islamist extremists, and we have to keep at least an eye and pressure on them, if not run a campaign or help the host nation run a campaign that can actually address the sources of grievance and all the rest of that. And again, the list goes on. There are cyber threats that are increasingly pressing. Think of that plate or that tent full of these different plates that we have to keep spinning, again, uniquely. It means that we have to be capable for our military forces and everything from low-end, almost civil support to domestic authorities, peacekeeping, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, through sort of mid-level conflict, and then all the way to the very high-end possible peer-on-peer conflict, which so devastatingly destructive. It's something we must deter above all else. But the requirements, again, for our military forces and frankly for our other governmental entities in addressing all of these, the military could almost exclusively focus on what turned out to be counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, although even in the later years of those, obviously, it was very clear that we had to do the rebalance to Asia. We had to spend a lot more time, effort, resources there. Nonetheless, the challenges for those in uniform in the wake of the Cold War, in the wake of the Gulf War, were much narrower than they are today, where you have to span this entire area. And by the way, we still have to do some of those, quote, smaller missions in terms of keeping an eye on extremists. We still need to keep the forces we have in Syria. If our forces pull out, the Syrian Democratic Forces won't be able to continue their effort. We went back into Somalia. We've got to figure out how, together with our allies, we're going to address the challenges of Mali and West Africa, given the very disappointing developments there. And again, we can walk our way around the world, so we still have to perform those tasks, even as we're preparing now with greater urgency than at any time in the last several decades for the very substantial, again, peer-on-peer kind of conflict that, again, we must deter.
But
absolutely.
It seems like an incredibly tall order. I mean, governing in the end really is about choosing. It's about setting priorities. FDR quipped about Lincoln, that Lincoln died a sad man because he couldn't have everything. And the real question, I suppose, is, and it more than rhetorical is how do we set priorities? I mean, one of my former bosses, the late Madeleine Albright, borrowed a phrase from Bill Clinton, who used it in a speech, referred to the United States as the indispensable power. Now, that strikes me as, frankly, almost beyond our capacity.
I don't think so, actually. Again, yes, you have to prioritize. Yes, you can do all that you would like to do for a number of these different. That's why manage, that term that you used, I think is the really accurate description of the way we have to approach a lot of these. We're not going to resolve the issues in Somalia that lead to the challenges that they have with extremists. We can try, we can contribute. What we can do, though, is have a very modest deployment that does the so-called train and equip and then advise, assist, enable operations. And our Army wisely has created, advise, and assist security force assistance brigades. And they're much scaled down of a normal brigade. It's what we were doing toward the end in Afghanistan and so forth before we had these, where we would take a brigade of 3,500, 4,000, strip it down to 15 to 2,000, 1,500 to 2,000, and send it out to do advise and assist missions. And now we have forces configured for that. There's about 5 brigades like that. They can rotate through various challenges around the world, do it very efficiently, very economically, and therefore in a way that I believe is sustainable, which is what's required because, again, no one can foresee when some of these situations can be fully resolved. So you have to sustain your commitment. Again, I did argue that the decision that we reached to withdraw from Afghanistan would be one that we would come to regret. I'd like to think that we recognize that, given the very, very challenging, tragic situation there, and also the ramifications of that, which allowed our potential adversary to say, see, we told you the U.S. is not a dependable partner and they are a great power in decline. I actually think we can manage all of these different tasks with, again, clear priorities. And obviously, the number one priority has to do with the Indo Pacific and deterring the possibility of true conflict between our alliance and between China.
Right. Leadership is critically important. And the old saw that a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk is critically important, and we're going to need help. So let's begin our little tour with Russia and Ukraine. So 4 months into this war, naked savage aggression by Russia against Ukraine. Quickly, trenchantly, how would you evaluate the Biden administration's response during the first 4 months?
I think it actually has been quite impressive. Again, if I'm going to criticize them on Afghanistan, I have. I think it's only fair to give them credit for having led quite impressively.
Yeah.
Think about what they did at the very beginning. They took what are essentially finished intelligence products. They laundered them for release as public information without exposing sources and methods. That's actually not all that easy. And yet it established the credibility of what the U.S. was saying because all of what we predicted came to pass. And it also enabled the administration to bring the allies and partners along before the invasion took place to prepare for the kinds of sanctions on the economy, financial system, and so forth, and export controls, et cetera, that would be imposed very, very swiftly. Certainly, there are certain capabilities I'd like to have seen us get in their hands more rapidly. Even now, there are some that, again, we've drawn down basically all that we have of Switchblade drones in our inventory, these loitering munitions. 108 heavy artillery pieces, 155. I mean, this is a staggering. The challenge for Ukraine actually is to absorb all of this, to train their soldiers on systems that are different from theirs and a different caliber, and just 220,000 rounds of 155 millimeter howitzer ammunition. I mean, this is thousands and thousands of truckloads of ammunition, depending on how they're configured. If it's a regular 5-ton truck, you're talking many, many thousands just to haul it all in from where it's being landed and positioned just outside the border of Western Ukraine. And again, I think that they have worked very assiduously. Look, they're helped because of what Putin has done. I mean, Putin set out to make Russia great again. What he's actually done is make NATO great again. get two more members knocking on the door that will add very considerably to the alliance. Now, the question, though, I think, Aaron, really is going to be whether this can be sustained. We do have bipartisan, and you said this hyper-partisanship. I would submit that there are two areas at the very least in which there is very substantial bipartisan support. Number one is on the effort to support Ukraine. Minority Leader McConnell came together with the Majority Leader and others. A very substantial majority passed that in the Senate. $40 billion package that will carry us well through probably the midterm elections. And then, frankly, I think on China as well. I think the previous administration changed the narrative on China. This administration has continued it with bipartisan support on the Hill, and also then added the component of allies and partners being embraced as part of that approach. But I think again that exists. So I think again it's quite an impressive example of leadership by the United States in the wake of an endeavor, Afghanistan, where people did call into question our leadership. There is indispensable nature to what the U.S. brings. Look, we saw that just when we decided to leave Afghanistan, even though we only had 3,500 troops and the coalition was 8,500, they couldn't even conceive of staying without the foundation that the U.S. provides by its presence and all of the capabilities that it was bringing to bear in that particular situation. So again, I think impressive. Yes, there are certain capabilities I'd like to see much more rapidly provided, but we're literally at the stage now where the Department of Defense is having to go to contractors to actually produce what we're going to send. It's no longer just about drawing down what we have, although one of the things we should draw down very quickly and provide to them is the Predator. It's called a different nomenclature because it's the Army system, but we should get those in our hands with a ton of Hellfire missiles to hang off them, and also more of the multiple launch rocket systems once the four that have been used for training.
I was going to ask you about what you thought Ukraine needed on the battlefield. We had a brief discussion off camera, and I resurrected the Tolstoy quote about the two most important warriors are time and patience. Two most important warriors are time and patience. 4 months into this campaign, and maybe this is the media, they're so impatient, everything is so breathless. 4 months into the campaign, it seems, though, that a sort of trend line has been established. Neither side seems to be able to achieve their ultimate victory, and yet neither side can afford defeat. And you're beginning to see challenges and problems. There's a lot of emerging criticism that the administration isn't acting aggressively enough with respect to the provision of weaponry. You have a campaign in the Donbass. David Ignatius asked today or yesterday in one of his columns, is the tide turning in favor of Russia? He said no. But then again, the question is time and patience, and what defines victory, and for whom. The Europeans now appear to be divided into a quote-unquote peace party composed of France, Germany, Britain, who want to see this conflict over sooner, and a quote-unquote justice party, not surprisingly, articulated by those closer to Russia, the Poles and the Balts. So I guess you think the Donbass is changing, the campaign there is changing in favor of the Russians? And what is the significance if, in fact, they can establish control over large amounts of eastern Ukraine?
Well, look, first of all, I think that ultimately the embattled city right now that is the focus of most Russian forces, Severodonetsk, in that sort of elbow of eventually the Ukrainians will have to evacuate from that. But they've made the Russians pay an unbelievable price. I mean, the casualties that the Russians have sustained, my sense is that at least every 2 days, if not every day, they are losing more soldiers than we lost in the worst month of the surge in Iraq. It's that high, day after day after day after day. It's at least 20,000. It could be closer to 25 or even 30,000. They've lost easily over 1,000 tanks. There's almost 800 confirmed, actually, with metadata from photos and other sources, and many, many more that have not yet been actually documentary confirmation. It's not just a costly, bloody, destructive battle of attrition. It's also a forced generation competition where Russia is trying to scour their military, and also Syria and other places, the replace their losses and the wounded. Ukraine doing the same, but Ukraine also having to incorporate this massive quantity of weapon systems and ammunition, many of which weapon systems they have to train to use. And then, so you train the individuals, then you create units, you've got to create the logistics to support that, and all the rest of this. But Russia's trying to do the same, and they're finding, of course, predictably, their corruption in the maintenance of the systems that were in their mothball fleets. It turns out that they're not ready in this kind of issue. That's one of the aspects of this. But I think we may see the base case probably is that, yes, Russia will take the remainder of including Severodonetsk. They may get a bit more of Donetsk Oblast, not that much more. And then they're going to harden the front lines, and they're going to run a referendum, and miraculously the Ukrainian people in those areas are going to say, we fervently wish to be citizens of the Russian Federation. Would you please annex us? President Putin will graciously accede to their request, make them part of the Russian Federation, maybe have a halt to what their kinds of more offensive operations are, just harden it all, make it really difficult for the Ukrainians to take it back. By the way, you can't rule out that the Ukrainians over here, just east of Mykolaiv, which was halfway to Odessa, the Russians never got through that, where they've been on a counteroffensive. Maybe they could get all the way back and retake Kherson, Kherson. Right. If that happens, very important, they can push the flank. Maybe they can push the flank from Kharkiv and so forth. But the real question is not just between President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, looks in the mirror and doesn't see the leader who has made a catastrophically bad decision that's resulted in irreparable damage to its economy and financial system, however well suited they are to withstand sanctions because of their energy production, the minerals, the grains, and so forth. But the damage he's done, he sees the leader of the Russian people, and they know how to suffer. And they suffered Napoleon, they suffered Hitler, but eventually prevailed. And he thinks they'll prevail when it comes to the contest of wills between Russia and certain European countries, some of whom have somewhat fragile coalition governments, and who are seeing inflation, seeing economic slowdown, seeing other challenges as a result of this war, and understand back to business as usual. But again, and that is a big question. There could be a question even perhaps about the U.S., although again, as I noted, this seems to be so substantially supported by a bipartisan majority that I think we can weather that for quite some time. But think of the duration of this. If that new frozen conflict, new front lines emerges as the reality, there will be no end to it. To tell me then that question that I asked, forgetting that I was on the record with Rick Atkinson during the fight to Baghdad, it may not end. It's one possibility. There are other possibilities. It's not impossible Russia could prevail in some way. It's even quite conceivable, that the Ukrainians, given their incredible resourcefulness, professionalism, really just tremendous initiative, on top of heart and determination, and an entire nation mobilized for war, that they could actually take back some of this as well. But it is a very, very closely and brutally contested situation.
You didn't articulate the question you raised with Rick Atkinson, which was, how does this end? How does this end? And you raised a number of possibilities that it may not.
Yeah,
it may not.
and for
That does raise an interesting question.
you could have a negotiation, as you noted earlier, rightly, I think. Vladimir Putin wants to see what else he can achieve on the battlefield. He's not concerned about these losses, at least not yet. His approval ratings are up 15 percentage points. He's not sitting in the Kremlin every night doing what we did in the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan, writing letters to American mothers and fathers whose sons and daughters have been lost.
Is it too early? Kissinger raises questions about how does this end, and whether or not the United States should be asking pointed questions. And many people accuse him of appeasement. I think the reality is that we have to ask these questions. Now, it can be internal.
By the way, he was misinterpreted what he said. Right. It was basically going back to the pre-24 February, which actually President Zelensky would have accepted when he offered negotiations with Ukraine becoming neutral, and also some kind of arrangement where Russia could hang Crimea.
Is it too early to be asking Zelensky for his assessment of how this ends? I noted it's interesting that the New York Times has now reported twice that the Ukrainians are not sharing tactical intelligence with the United States. We know a lot about what the Russians are doing, but we don't seem to know much about Ukrainian losses or battlefield tactics during the actual military campaign. I understand the moral hazard here. Any talk of a negotiation is, betrays weakness in a conflict that is still quite dynamic. But I just wonder, I wish I had as much confidence as you do in the American body politics capacity to basically continue to generate large amounts of military, economic, and financial. It's not just military.
No, of course not.
It's economic and financial aid. And Ukraine, I hate to say it, but it's true. Freedom House defines Ukraine as partly, quote unquote, partly free. And on the corruption index, it does extremely badly. Too, by the way, about how the monitoring of this economic and financial assistance is taking place in Ukraine. But again, I raise these questions because there's simply been too many times when the United States fails to ask questions. The exit, how does it end? And, as a veteran of Afghanistan and Iraq, this only too well.
I don't think it's too early to privately discuss something like this with President Zelensky, but it would have to be someone who's absolutely trusted, and that it is not going to then be leaked out, because the reasons that you just described. It could actually influence what happens. Look, I don't think it's a secret that presumably the reason the leaders of France, Germany, and Italy are going to Kyiv before the G7 meeting is probably to get some sense of this. What is the answer to it? So again, I don't think it's to figure out what is it. Number one, what are we trying to accomplish? How do we get there? And again, not redefining it overly much every time the context changes, noting that, yes, you do need to do some of that, certainly. And there has been a lot of that, of course, in this case. I think the expectations that Russia would prevail in their main objective initially, which was to take the capital, I would like Kyiv, much less control it, and they have not. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty until you really see how the Ukrainians perform on the battlefield. How far have they truly come since 2014? I visited them in 2019. I was hugely impressed by all that they had achieved. Yet you still don't know until it actually happens. And so, yes, when we've seen the incredible determination, skill, resourcefulness, creativity of men and women in uniform, again, that I think inspired the world to help them. But again, as you note, it is fair, I think, to ask, what do we start to envision as some kind of end state without undermining what President Zelensky is trying to do, which is to maintain a nation that has truly mobilized. You know, the irony here as well is that no one has done more to spark, enable, catalyze Ukrainian nationalism than Vladimir Putin.
We could spend another hour unpacking Ukraine, but let's move on to China and let's point apart. We have a lot to cover and not a whole lot of time to cover it. If you had to define the most important American interest with respect to China, what would it be?
It's to figure out how to essentially to work together. And by that, I don't mistake this. It's how to exist peacefully, noting that we each one of the other's top 2 or 3 trading partners. Yes, there is some decoupling that is taking place in certain sectors, not the least of which is the IT and social media and a variety of others, and then anything is dual use and economic interchange makes it completely impossible, implausible that we could ever totally decouple in any way, shape, or form. So we are destined to have to work together. And also, of course, as part of that, to dissuade decision makers in China from ever taking an action that could result in direct conflict, being reasonably confident that we're not going to spur that from.
I mean, I guess I hear a lot of talk about containment and potential confrontation. Not much about.
It's just not possible. Again, there will be selective decoupling. I mean, we could see an outbound investment, an outbound version of CFIUS, which is, of course, investment in the U.S., the Committee of Foreign Investment in the U.S. There could be something outbound that could. There could be a variety of other, in addition to the entities list and other restrictions that already exist on trade with China. But that's not going to stop a huge amount of the trade that does place. To progress in terms of globalism, albeit it's going to be at a much slower rate of growth. It's already happened.
Right. As I look around, though, I see tensions of Taiwan, over tariffs, over the Uyghurs, over the South China Sea, over Ukraine. When I ask people where are the areas for cooperation, they fall back on important issues like climate. Pandemic becomes extremely tricky for these reasons. But how do you define a serious U.S. policy toward China? And do we have one now?
Well, it has not actually been fully announced, as you know, number one. And reportedly, it has been delayed a little bit longer. And, who talk, Kurt Campbell and others are looking forward to seeing, quite an impressive policy when it is fully unveiled. We have tried to answer, again, this should be a partners approach to China. We all know there's a glaring gap because of the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So there's no trade component.
Yes.
Administration has put forward the Indo Pacific economic framework as an attempt to answer that. It's obviously, I guess, it's better than it's a good bit better than nothing, but it is not there's no lowering of barriers to free trade, et cetera, that you would have had with Trans-Pacific Partnership, and no prospect of getting back to that with either of the parties in the U.S. right now. But that kind of approach, I think, is exactly what is called for. They set out in the very beginning, our allies and partners, reinvigorating some of those relationships, noting that some were certainly still strong. And then we got a bit focused, obviously derailed because of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We have obviously Ukraine taking up an enormous amount of time and effort, as it should, but the administration trying to get back to main effort, which is, again, the Indo Pacific and the challenges of forging, who has described the relationship as severe competition. That is not trivial.
One question, and I fascinating conversation, but I want to move on to Iran and North Korea, and then conclude with a comment about our domestic travails. Strategic clarity for Taiwan in terms of U.S. policy, or strategic ambiguity? It seems we have a little both, and I'm just wondering what's your view on it?
I think that it's no longer a misstep or a slip up, or never leaving something left unsaid, to have not once but twice but 3 times President Biden indicate in an answer that it's maybe not quite as strategically ambiguous as made out to be, although then, yes, there's no change to our policy. And again, look, deterrence at the end of the day is a function of a potential adversary's perception of 2 elements: your capabilities, and we're working very hard to overhaul the capabilities that we have in the Indo Pacific, together with their perception of your willingness to employ them. And if that helps a bit to, again, indicate that there should be an expectation that the U.S. would participate in some reasonably significant manner, again, that is the essence of deterrence. And I think, again, that this is not just, a slip of the tongue when it happens 3 times.
Again, I'd love to continue this. We're going to run out of time. And I want to talk, let's package Iran and North Korea together in the sense that you have a de facto nuclear weapon state in North Korea, continuing to launch and test ballistic missiles, and the sense is that they're due for a 7th nuclear test. And Iran, presumably a putative, maybe a threshold nuclear weapon state, unclear. Let's start with Iran. Joe Biden is fond of saying, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And that's a defense of the highly problematic, but still, I would argue, functional Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Doesn't look like that's coming. The chances, to quote one observer, was less than 50% and more than 0. If, in fact, there is no agreement, there is a plan B. The Israelis have essentially identified it. But how does the United States figure out a way, if in fact you think this is worth doing, preventing an Israeli strike and making an American strike unnecessary? Some people think ultimately that the problem will only be resolved as a consequence of one or both of those happening. But I wonder, how do you create real deterrence? Because that's what we're talking about.
Well, you have to, again, what is the potential adversary's perception of your capabilities and your willingness to employ them? When we've drawn down the Middle East so much, and I guess it's somewhat understandable why we keep trying to do that. But, at some point we have to recognize that for the U.S. to leave the Middle East is a little bit like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just can't do it. You just keep getting pulled back in. And you might as well accept that. And back to our idea of managing, you have to have a certain degree of capability to manage that. And by the way, this integrated air defense and ballistic missile defense system of Iran, and also the developments they have, not just in missiles and accuracy, but also with drones and a variety of other capabilities. Bottom line is, you're not going to get back to the agreement, which prevents them from getting to weapons grade, and they are as close as they are right now. There's better be some rehearsals going on, and ideally they need to know that those rehearsals are going on. You note that, yes, there's an Israeli plan B, but the Israelis have always been quite open that they do not have ammunition that can crack one of those sites. Don't even have a plane that could carry it if they had it. And so their operation at best could address some of the challenge, and noting, of course, look, if you do this, it sets it back for a few years, perhaps, and you may have to do it again. But if we truly mean what we say, Aaron, the policy is that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. If that really is our policy, and this is not something like the red line that turned out not to be a red line, the perceptions of will. If that is really our policy, we are going to have to dust some plans off that were made publicly known when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command. So, because again, only we have the capability with confidence to do what is necessary there. And again, if the policy is they can't have a nuclear weapon, and that's why lumping Iran and North Korea together with great respect is not particularly good idea.
It's a time constraint.
And I actually tend to think that Iran is going to become the crisis of the moment in the next weeks or at most months, depending on what it is that Iran does. And noting, of course, reportedly they're preparing yet another deeply buried site not far from Natanz, similar to the one that they have at Fordo near Golm. So this to allow proliferation of nuclear weapons to a country that supports extremism in various forms throughout the Middle East and beyond, then we are going to have to get very, very serious about, as I said, dusting off and rehearsing plans that were established in the past and rehearsed, and adjusting them for the fact that the Iranian capacity and problematic, and their air defenses and ballistic missile defenses are much more capable as well than they were, say, 10 years or so or more ago. We were in the final stages of negotiating the JCPOA. And remember that the argument at that time was, we don't get this, we have to go to war. Well, I think that still, sadly, is the reality. And it does not look like we're going to get even back to the original JCPOA, whose sunset clauses are a lot closer now than they were back then. That was the biggest of the problem, as you'll recall, not to mention letting Iraq and support Bashar al-Assad and continue to foment problems in Lebanon, among others, including Yemen.
Another problem without a solution. Now, to North Korea.
There is a solution. Actually is a solution. Again, does not resolve it for all time. And it is very, very, again, challenging, risky, etc. But if the policy really is what we believe it is, what it is said to be, about getting the operations, the capabilities, and so forth in place to respond if that is required. I mean, that's what the military has to do at the end of the day. Right. If their understanding of the policy is what we all publicly believe it to be.
I'd say we have time to discuss North Korea, but I think we probably don't. And I do want to ask you about domestic travails here. I think you told one interviewer that when you were two-star, you stopped voting, basically. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Right. So
even
you're prepared to provide advice.
And I give advice to members of either party.
Exactly.
And so forth.
Right. So the Republic has got, I would argue the greatest challenge we face is not from abroad at all. It's from the crisis of confidence in institutions that we're going through right now, and I suspect it's only going to worsen. But I have a question for you. You are that the structure of the military, the clear division between civil and military relationships, that if given an order by a president that was deemed to be illegal and unconstitutional, that the highest echelons of the U.S. military would be willing and able to resist those orders. Now, I say this was a thought experiment, but I'm afraid, tragically, it's really not a thought experiment. And I'm just curious as to your views on that.
No, I'm very confident in that, actually. And I will say that I do wish that a number of my counterparts, some of the senior retired officers, would refrain from some of the more just beyond overt. I mean, when you speak at a political nominating convention or something like that, that's beyond sort of contributing to thoughtful discourse and so forth. And again, that has, just as we have seen the development of hyperpartisanship in the we've also seen that break out, if you will, in the ranks, at least of the retired military as well. And it's very unhelpful to those who followed us. Our biggest objective should be to help those who followed us to avoid being seen as potentially partisan. I mean, look, you always have these challenges. I mean, there were folks in my last years in uniform who tried to dissuade them from that, to say, trust me, this is not going to happen. But there are still suspicions about that. That's not helpful. We had challenges at one time where there was a sense we were trying to unduly influence or box a president in or something like that, which was not intentional, but was perceived. You just can't have that. And it's really unhelpful if those in retired rank explicitly, and because it reflects on those who are still in uniform, who are having to perform these very difficult tasks that you described, and make sure that what they do is certain to the Constitution of the United States, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm confident that those who have made it through the ranks to the very senior positions have the fortitude to withstand the kinds of party strength, the resolve to withstand, again, something that actually was not legal or constitutional. And there have been open discussions about some of this. I think perhaps even a bit more than perhaps might have been the case,
right,
in some of the books that have come out about the previous administration and what the senior military was doing at various times.
I want to be confident about the institutions and norms of the republic. We've been through worse, although I suspect we've never quite been here before, where we are now. But I want to thank you.
Much worse. I think the Civil War obviously was incomparably horrific for our country, and it wasn't truly completely resolved by the surrender at Appomattox and the subsequent surrenders. It took many, many decades, arguably a century, to further resolve issues, and some of those are still with us. And again, this is where it is actually heartening to see the bipartisan support for the U.S. effort writ large, not just for this administration, but for the U.S. overall in supporting Ukraine, and also, again, supporting a comprehensive integrated whole of governments approach to China.
We're out of time. You'll have to come back. I hope you will. But I want to thank you for your expertise and your wisdom. And again, I close with a quote from Jack Kennedy, at least attributed to him. Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusion. The notion that things can change. They're not hopeless. But as you go through the process of transaction and transformation, you must go through it with your eyes wide open. The mix of idealism and realism, tethered, is what I suspect ends up making the most effective, most prudent and wisest foreign policy for our country. But General Petraeus, thanks so much for joining.
And thanks for what you're doing, spurring these kinds of very thoughtful exchanges. I hope thoughtful.
Appreciate
You bet. Thank you.